Lavinia Fisher, supposedly America's first female serial killer. Her story has been told countless times during ghost tours in Charleston, South Carolina. The legend goes that Lavinia grew up to marry John Fisher, and the couple lived near Charleston, South Carolina. The pair made their living operating a hotel called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House, which they managed in the early 1800s. Mysteriously, men who were visiting Charleston began to disappear. As more and more reports were filed with the authorities regarding these missing men, it was determined that they were last seen at the 6 Mile Wayfarer House, which was called such because it was 6 miles outside of Charleston. Though the local authorities began an investigation, there was no evidence that the Fishers were involved. This, coupled with their popularity in the town, led to the investigation being dropped. Lavinia was a beautiful and charming woman, adding to her popularity in the community and the hotel's business. However, it would later be learned that she utilized those characteristics to help her husband rob and kill many male travelers. And as more and more men went missing, the rumor mill began to do its work. The locals soon gathered a group of vigilantes who went to the Fishers in February of 1819 to stop the activities. Though it is unknown what they may have said or done, they were satisfied with their task and returned to Charleston, leaving one man named David Ross to stand watch in the area. Early the following day, David Ross was attacked by 2 men and dragged before a group of men, along with Lavinia Fisher. He looked to her for help, but she choked him and smashed his head through a window. Somehow, Ross was able to escape and alert authorities. At nearly the same time, John Peoples traveled from Georgia to Charleston and, tired from his long trip, stopped at the 6 Mile house to see if they had a room. He was warmly greeted by the beautiful Lavinia, who informed him they didn't have a room available, but invited him for tea and a meal. Her company was so pleasant that he ignored Lavinia's husband's odd glances at him and chatted with her, answering her every question. When she excused herself from the table momentarily, she returned with tea and good news. A room had suddenly become available, and if John still wanted it. He accepted, and Lavinia poured him a cup of tea. John didn't like tea but didn't want to seem impolite, so instead of refusing it or leaving it untouched, he poured it out when she wasn't looking. Afterward, she showed him to his room. He then began to wonder why she had asked him so many questions. Why was her husband staring at him all evening? Suddenly, he felt uncomfortable. With all the information he had provided and worried, he might become a target for robbery. Feeling safer in the chair by the door than in the bed, he dozed until a loud noise awakened him. Looking around, he realized that the bed he should have been sleeping in had disappeared into a deep hole beneath the floor. John quickly jumped out the window, got on his horse, and fled to authorities in Charleston. Police then arrested John and Lavinia Fisher, and 2 men they had been operating with. The 6 Mile Wayfarer house was thoroughly searched, and the grounds were dug up, filled with hidden passages. The sheriff reportedly found items that could be traced to dozens of travelers. A tea laced with an herb that could put someone to sleep for hours. A mechanism that could be triggered to open the floorboards beneath the bed. And in the basement, as many as 100 sets of remains. And on the morning of February 18th, 1820, the Fishers were taken from Charleston jail to be hanged on the gallows behind the building. John Fisher quietly prayed with the minister, whom he had asked to read a letter. Before a crowd of some 2,000 people, the letter insisted on his innocence and asked for mercy for those who had done him wrong in the judicial process. He then began to verbally plead his case before the crowd, but he asked for their forgiveness before being hanged. Lavinia did not go so quietly. She had requested to wear her wedding dress, and, refusing to walk to the gallows, had to be picked up and carried as she ranted and raved. Before the crowd, she screamed pointedly at the Charleston socialites, whom she blamed for encouraging a conviction. Before her executioners would tighten the noose around her neck, she yelled into the crowd, "Cease! I will have none of it!" If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me. I'll carry it. Then before they could finish the job, she jumped off the scaffold herself. Not quite reaching the ground, she dangled down into the crowd. Later, onlookers would say they had never seen such a wicked stare or chilling sneer as on the 28-year-old Lavinia's face. Quite the compelling tale, right? Well, what if I told you all of that, besides Lavinia's last words, was utter bullshit, including the charge of highway robbery? Today on Historical Quarrels, we're going to set the record straight and tell the real story of John and Lavinia Fisher, who weren't murderers or bandits. Instead, they were victims of government corruption, greedy uncles, and rotten-ass luck being born in the wrong era. So sit down and get your conspiracy caps on for today's Historical Quarrels. Welcome back to Historical Quarrels, everyone. Today's intro is going to be a wee bit longer than normal due to today's cold open being much longer than in previous episodes. Listen, I gave you guys about 5 minutes of content right there at the beginning, okay? So if you're upset with this right now, fucking deal with it, all right? First off, big shout out to Mike Ritz and the New Belief Studio. He's a talented listener of the show and a good friend. Recommended some great games to me and can't wait to try them out. He makes some of the coolest minis, wallets, keychains, and leather apparel that's great for cosplay or if you just want to look like a badass warrior. Seriously, the guy makes some really cool shit. Please go check out his shop online at newbeliefstudio.com. It's really cool. I mean, he made these really cool like Beetlejuice minis, and you can go see it on his online store. And I don't know, man. Like, I'm into D&D, and like if I ever had like a Beetlejuice inspired like setting or like part of my campaign, I'd definitely go to him, ask him to make something. So again, that is newbeliefstudio.com. Please go check it out. Second off, next week's episode will be much shorter than normal, as with the previous week to this episode. This is due to the fact that I will be on vacation with my family. Now that that's out of the way, let me give you a rundown of today's episode. First, I will be going over Charleston and what it was like during the year these quote-unquote killings and highway robbery took place. And then I will be going over events as they actually happened, according to documents that were pulled and found by Bruce Orr, whose book 6 Miles to Charleston I will be using today as the majority of for source of information. He does a very good job of compiling everything. If you are interested in learning a bit more about that time period in history, he goes over stuff in way more detail than I do in today's episode. I'm going to be focused on the tale of John and Lavinia. He goes over a couple other events surrounding that and makes a very compelling argument at the end as to who was actually, out to get them. I will be going over some of those theories, not quite as in detail. So if you want that, please go purchase the book 6 Miles to Charleston by Bruce Orr. I haven't written to him and been like, hey, man, I'm going to use your book. I haven't asked him that yet, but I figured as long as I say this and make sure everyone understands that this book does a great job of that, hopefully the author's not too mad that I'm using this, but it's on the historypress.net for the online edition, for the ebook version. So if you want to get that. But so yeah, after we go over all the events in order based off of the documents, we'll then go over some of those conspiracies. I'll go over the ones that I believe, and part of that's going to be part of the new segment for today's show after the, I guess, quote unquote timeline in a way. So let's go ahead and get into the main chunk of the episode then, shall we? You are listening to Historical Quarrels. Charleston, South Carolina, in 1819, was a city of fear, paranoia, and was on the verge of economic collapse. During this time in America, James Monroe was the president. Slavery was at its peak, though some early divides had begun between the states already on that issue. And the fear of a slave rebellion or native tribes attacking was an ever-present thought for its citizens. Not only that, but slavery had recently been declared an act of piracy on the high seas, and President Monroe had been allowed by Congress to send U.S. vessels to suppress the African slave trade, which really fucked over Charleston, as it was once one of the biggest slave markets in the country, and its slave population outnumbered the white population 3-1, with around 50,000 African slaves and 15,000 white people. Charleston had faced slave rebellions before, back in 1720 and in 1739, but in 1819, Charleston was again afraid of another uprising occurring, and in fact their fears were well-founded because in 1822, a highly organized and nearly complete slave uprising was uncovered, and its leader, Denmark Vesey, would die because of it. He had supposedly amassed around 10,000 fellow slaves to join him in this revolt, which would have been fucking awesome if he was able to do that, but kick some racist ass. But unfortunately, it's not how it worked out. And in addition to this, the United States was in its first ever economic depression, known as the Panic of 1819. This was caused by President Madison's superfluous spending during his last 2 years in office, 1815 and 1816, where he and Congress would allocate a majority of the U.S. budget for their international diplomatic trips. Where it was eventually discovered that these trips weren't to multiple foreign countries, but instead just to France, specifically to the Palais Royal in Paris, where Madison and supposedly Napoleon, before he was captured, and then King Louis XVIII and various other unnamed U.S. government officials would meet, and instead of discussing international policies and establishing more beneficial trade relations, they partied hard. I'm talking drugs, whores, alcohol, the whole ordeal. What's odd is the fact that despite Congress and the president knowing this was a clear misuse of taxpayer funds, they still marked every expense, and those lists would be kept secret until 1950 when the White House released the documents detailing all of those expenses. Here is a list dated the 4th of January of 1815. This was the official diplomatic delegation expenses for Paris, France, 1815. Delegates, President James Madison, various U.S. Congress officials, King Louis XVIII. Location, Paris, France, mainly in the vicinity of Palais Royal. Currency was in francs. The expenses, number one, we had lodging at the Palais Royal vicinity. Accommodations for President Madison and officials was around 2,000 francs. Servants' quarters was about 500 francs. Transportation, the carriage rental for the duration of the stay was 300 francs. Horse care and stable fees was around 150. Then we had fine dining at renowned Parisian establishments with about 1,500 francs. Casual meals and snacks for the delegation and staff and whores, which was around 700 francs. Then we had entertainment and gifts. There were opera and theater tickets at the Palais Royal for 800 francs, which at that time, the Palais Royal would put on very sexually explicit shows. There were gifts for French prostitutes and hosts. It was around 1,000 francs. Private tours of the Louvre and Versailles, about 400 francs. Some communication expenses, postal services accumulated to about 100 francs. Courier services was about 200 francs. And then some miscellaneous. There was custom tailoring and fashion accessories to attend formal events, about around 600 francs. Translation services, about 300 francs. Donation to the local Parisian charities, 200 francs. Hush money to Priscilla for her not to mention President Madison's nightly routine, which included being cradled like an infant, being tied up and told he is a bad boy, having one of Congress be present during coitus and using a gavel to gently squish the president's testicles. Also during coitus, the president would have King Louis present in the room while he was also engaged in the act of coitus and hold hands. Sometimes the king would also ask an official from Congress to lightly tap his testicles with a gavel, but would request that while doing so, they would be reciting the Bill of Rights at him. President Madison sips loudly from his nightly glass of milk and asked to not have that mentioned as well. The president snores and is asked that not to be mentioned as well. Payment agreed by Priscilla was 2,000 francs. Emergency fund was about 500 francs for unforeseen expenses. The total estimated expense was around 11,450 francs, which, if you think about, that is a grievous misuse of government funds. And due to this and multiple trips very similar to this one, the economic boom that the U.S. had initially experienced at the end of the War of 1812 would be depleted and the country was left without a lot of options for trade as well, since by 1819, Europe had experienced the financial hardships caused by the Napoleonic Wars, which meant their demand from the US decreased significantly, because they also didn't have enough money, food, or anything, since, Napoleon kind of burnt everything to the fucking ground. On top of that, Charleston was a port town, and so another rising concern was piracy on the high seas. Captain Jack Sparrow was out there. He was messing with people. Maybe not him, but other pirates. And by this time, pirates had realized that using their own flags and colors was a great way to be shot on sight by some country's navy. And so instead of being a bunch of dumbasses and literally painting a target on their backs, they would capture military vessels and use those to disguise themselves and steal a shit ton of money from ships exporting or importing goods. On top of that, they would also go into port every now and then and become land pirates and sack a town of its money. In addition to all of this, there was a fever epidemic sweeping its way across the South. And for those of you familiar with American history, you know that fever was in fact boogie fever, a term that was coined after a sickness spread across the U.S. due to public gatherings to listen to a new type of music invented by John Fanning Watson and his clergy of mixed-race performers. Many historians consider this to be the true first band of jazz musicians. Unfortunately, it was bad luck for this band due to the mass spreading of this boogie fever. Many southern states would outlaw this type of music, deeming it to be ungodly and a weapon for the devil to help the African slave cause the white man harm, even though it was primarily the slave population that would die due to the boogie fever. Oddly, another reason for the name of the fever to be titled boogie was due to one of the symptoms causing the body to convulse and jump, twist and twirl in an almost rhythmic-like pattern until they would die from exhaustion, kind of looking like a dance. And clearly I'm fucking with you. It was the yellow fever epidemic, but hopefully I made that believable enough that I got a few of you to say, "Oh, dude, no way! That's crazy! That's where boogie fever comes from." No, it was there's a band that did the song titled "Boogie Fever," and what's funny enough though is the symptoms that I described are actual symptoms of a different disease, but it was spread in Germany around 1374. But all of this is to point out that Governor Geddes of South Carolina was in a tight spot financially, the current governor during this time period when these events would take place. And he would need a way to generate wealth for the state and himself during this time. It must have been getting real fucking desperate and would do anything to get himself out of a pickle. This guy quite literally used his own son to fight a duel for him, and his son would end up getting shot twice in the leg because of it. Because, he can't fight his own battles. He just wants to slime his way out of everything. And that is legit. I'm not messing here. That's who we're dealing with. That's the type of guy. Not only that, but Geddes would end up involved in America's first land fraud scheme in the purchase of Key West. So, we have a shady governor in charge of the state looking for ways to generate more income. And this will be very important later in our story. So with all of this in the way of generating revenue for the city, how did they generate income, you may ask yourself? Well, prostitution. Prostitution was the main method of doing so. So by essentially starting the pimp trade. No, I'm kidding. It was through wagon trade. And due to the desperation of people, highway robbery was commonplace for these wagon merchants. Because, again, this is also the primary merchants that are coming in and out now. And so these robbers they didn't have a lot of people to rob anymore on the high seas. And so they need to rob people on land. They had to be land pirates. But in response to these highway robberies, these rest houses essentially popped up between cities on the routes that these merchants would pass through. And the owners of these rest houses could make a decent living off of charging them room and board for the night or to use their water and feed for the merchants' horses. These houses' names were indicators for how far out they were from the city. So you'd have a 4-mile house that was 4 miles away from the city. The 4-mile Wayfarer house was, again, 4 miles away, 6 miles away, and, so on. John and Lavinia Fisher owned the 6 Mile Wayfarer house near Charleston. And by the time our story starts, there had been multiple incidents already reported to the sheriff of robbers and card cheats nearby in some of these mile houses. Even one of the Fisher's neighbors, Stephen Lacoste, had filed a complaint about a missing cow that had wandered off, and he was certain had, quote, gone about fucking all the other farmers, that cheating whore. To which the sheriff did not try to pry into further as to why Mr. Lacoste was so agitated about about his cow supposedly engaging in extramarital relations. Obviously kidding, but he did file a complaint about a missing cow and suspected the highway robbers or some sort of highway robbery gang were in the area and had stolen it or killed his cow. And, like most rational people back then, when enough people had said something that was happening and believed it, they decided to dish out their own version of colonial justice, utilizing the ever-convenient lynch law to justify getting a mob together to go out and weed out the supposed gang of robbers. And for those of you who don't know the term, lynch law or lynching, it comes from Charles Lynch, who was known for stamping out loyalists to the crown during the Revolutionary War and dishing out justice without going through due process. And I am sure that guy only ever punished actual traitors, and for sure never got it wrong and, just whipped and stole property from people that he just didn't like. 100% didn't do that. And, I forgot to mention, part of the law allowed people to seize property, which is important in this story, as we'll begin to see why and how John and Lavinia were targeted. So according to the rumor mill, not meal, man, I must be hungry. A gang of highway robbers had been active in the area of Ashley Ferry, which is just outside the city, and since no one could identify who the robbers were, the mob supposedly had permission from the owners of the farms that were being targeted to go out and find and disband this group of robbers themselves. The lynch mob first arrived at the 5 Mile Wayfarer house and found a small group of people there and ordered them to leave. And these people did not take kindly to that. They resisted, fought back, potentially killed a guy or two. The lynch mob decided to just set fire to the building, and it would be nothing but cinders in a short time. They then reorganized and went to the 6 Mile house, and probably because they had seen the smoke from the 5 Mile house down the road, John, Lavinia, and the rest of the occupants there complied quickly, and the mob left David Ross inside the building to keep watch. Now, something Bruce Orr stresses in this book, in his book, 6 Miles to Charleston, is to remind us that not one of the victims of the robberies could identify their assailants, and this mob was there without legal authority. And I want to stress this as well as we continue on, as it is something important to remember, because think about how you would feel if a bunch of assholes from the city decide that your business/home is part of this supposed gang that's been terrorizing other people in the area. Now these people come by with guns and tell you to get out. I am positive most of you, if you had a gun at home and you saw a bunch of people who aren't cops with guns coming to your home or business, you'd probably try to kill them, or at the very least want to kill them. Well, during David Ross's occupation of the 6 Mile house, an altercation took place and David Ross was attacked here. His sworn affidavit that was given to the sheriff on February 20th, 1819 goes, David Ross, having been duly sworn, deposeth that on yesterday about the hour of 9, William Haywood, I don't know why I'm doing it. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it in a southern accent. So Haywood came to the 6 Mile house of which he was in possession, accompanied by another person whose name is unknown by him, that the said Haywood cursed him, collared him violently, and pushed him out the doors. The deponent then again re-entered the house and asked to take away the few articles that belonged to him. Haywood put his hand into his bosom and said, "You damned infernal rascal, if you lay a hand on anything, I will blow your brains out." By this time, Fisher and his wife Lavinia Fisher came up, with 2 other men, whose names are unknown to him. That Lavinia Fisher laid violent hands upon him, choked and boxed his head through a pane of window glass. Whilst I was endeavoring to get away from them, Haywood and Fisher beat him unmercifully with loaded whips aided and assisted by 2 other men, whose names are unknown to him. There was also another woman who aided and assisted. Whilst they were beating him, the deponent leapt out of the piazza and crossed the road through the woods. Then he got to the 4-mile house, but just as he had entered the woods, they fired at him. He got at least into the main road and on his way to town, near the Freitas Bridge. He saw the whole party come into town. Fisher exclaimed several times, "You damned infernal rascal, if I ever catch you, I will give you 100 lashes." David Ross would later name James McElroy as one of the people responsible for beating his widow body. Oh, was sensuous. And, sorry. I mean, to be honest, this David Ross was part of that group that burnt down Hayward's home and business, and the Fishers were neighbors with Hayward, so my theory is Hayward arrived to the 6-mile house, told the Fishers what had happened to him, and then everyone rightly got pissed off and beat the shit out of this lynching asshole. Not only that, but David Ross is actually tangentially related to John Fisher, as he is the brother-in-law to one of Colonel George Fisher's daughters, which is important to remember because Colonel George Fisher is the uncle of John Fisher and is a potential suspect as to who would have set the Fishers up, essentially. Well, reportedly, 2 hours after David Ross got his widow pee-pee stomped in, a merchant by the name of John Peebles decided to head out, and on his journey stopped by the 6-mile house with some young boy in his care, probably a young worker or his son. It isn't mentioned who the young boy was. And even after seeing the 5-mile house was burnt to a crisp, I guess this guy just thought to himself, I can chill out here and be safe and be totally fine. I'll be super fine here. For some reason. And this is when another incident occurred. John Peebles' affidavit states, John Peebles, being duly sworn, deposeth that on yesterday forenoon, the 19th, until about 11 o'clock, as he was returning home from town to his residence in the country, he stopped near the forks of the road about 6 miles from town to water his horses. That whilst his horses were watering, a man came out of the 6-mile house and told a boy who was with him that he must give him his bucket, as he wanted to water his horse. The boy refused to give him the bucket, saying he wanted it himself. He swore he would have it, and immediately 9 or 10 persons among them, and among them a tall, stout woman, came out of the same house to the place where he was armed with clubs, guns, and pistols, and immediately made a violent assault on him. Some of them beating him with sticks and with their guns, and several times they flashed their pistols at him. That the woman appeared to be the most active in beating him, cutting him over the head and eyes with a stick. That after a while they left him and re-entered the same house, and the deponent proceeded about 200 yards on the road, when 2 of the same men came up to him on horseback, and stopped his wagon, and said to him that they would kill him, both of them, presenting pistols to him, and snapped them at him and demanded of him his money. They then searched his pocket, and took out his pocketbook, which contained his money counting between $35 and $40, and then rode back towards the house from whence they came, the 6-mile house. The deponent then came back to Charleston. The deponent doth not know the names of those persons who hath so cruelly beat him and robbed him, but that he hath just cause to believe among them was William Haywood, John Fisher, and his wife Lavinia Fisher, Joseph Roberts, and John Andrews as well. So with that there, now 2 reports and a list of names for Sheriff Colonel Nathaniel Green Cleary to go after. And he set out with a fairly large group, and the occupants of the 6-mile house surrendered without a fight. They were armed to the teeth, though, so with about 12 muskets and a powder keg. That was probably only intended to be used on that mob if they were to show up again. So John and Lavinia Fisher and James McElroy, Seth Young, and Jane Howard were all loaded up and brought into custody. While searching the 6-mile house, the gang, led by the sheriff, found no hidden chambers, cellars, nor anything else like that, which contained countless corpses. Because that is a myth that was made up by Peter Nielsen, who is some Scottish dude who wrote up a penny dreadful telling the tale. And his only proof of evidence for what he states in his tale is, I was like totally there, bro. Like, I was fucking there, man. I saw the bodies. I don't know why I'm giving him like a New Zealand accent, but because he's Scottish. I can't even like think right now. So like doing a Scottish accent's just not happening. But But it was very much like I was totally there, bro. Like, ugh, like, who's there, man? Fucking, don't question me. Not only that, but this guy wrote his book in 1830, which was 10 years after the actual events had taken place. Well, at least the executions. What the gang did find was a scared cow who looked a little bruised and reportedly would moo and shake violently as if trying to escape when Stephen Lacoste came to take it back home. Stephen, in a sworn statement, would say, "Now, gentlemen, I must thank ye on account of having returned my dear sweet Bessie to me. I will ensure Bessie does not go about floozing herself to just any farmer anymore. This bitch needs to be taught a lesson. Because you can't let bitches get uppity and start thinking your money is their money. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to teach Bessie what it means to be rough when being handled, so she knows not to wander off this far again. I still cannot believe she would go to the Fishers. I swear to God Almighty, John wouldn't know how to handle this much woman if it sat on his face. Thank you, officers. I'll be on my way now." The deponent then departed shortly after making this statement and proceeded to rub his cow's hindquarters rather roughly, while forcefully applying the back of his hand to the cow's face and yelling obscenities at her. The only dead bodies that did show up were on February 26th, 1819, when reports of a fresh grave found not on, but near the 6 Mile house showed up, and Coroner Stevens went to the location and found a dead man and an African woman in the shallow grave. They were both dead. They listed her with basically the N-word. I'm not going to say the N-word in this show. So, but like in the report. So I'm just not going to directly read from the report because I don't like that. You know, not my favorite way to like, even in history. It's not like I'm trying to hide history or like sugarcoat it. It's just, I don't like saying the word. So, for those of you there, like, why isn't he saying the N-word? Well, that's why. Because you don't have to. I can just say African woman, and you guys get it. It was a slave, and because people sucked back then and were super racist and terrible. Anyways, these people were believed to have passed 10 days prior to the incident being reported. It is possible this man was killed during the assault on the 5 Mile house, as they had fought back initially, and some casualties were reported, or at least some people were not accounted for, and so casualties were assumed. Also, while they did find a cow, it was dead. It was a dead cow, believed to have been Mr. Lacoste's cow, at least his hide. And he didn't come back to take his cow and say that weird shit. In case you were concerned, that was real, and asking yourselves why the hell they didn't stop that cow fucker. Which honestly, they probably wouldn't have. Even if, he was being fucking weird and just straight up blatantly admitting to cow fucking, as, and animal fucking was just considered a sin and would not be illegal until the 1950s in the U.S., which is wild as shit to think about. It took until the 50s here for the United States to be like, yeah, maybe we should make it illegal for people to fuck their animals. It's kind of weird. Like, that should be illegal now. The 50s. We're all like Zen and shit. Not really. The Babylonians in their society knew it needed to be illegal a few thousand years ago, but the United States didn't think to do that until the 50s, I guess. Oh my God. That's wild. Anyways, continuing on the story. Sorry, I like to go off on tangents in this show if you're a new listener. It's what I like to do. And if you don't like that, go find another show. Fuck you if you don't like it. Okay? Anyways, so now you know the Fishers probably never killed anyone and were the targets of a lynch mob and were taken to jail. On Monday morning, February 22nd, 1819, Sheriff Cleary had John and Lavinia Fisher, James McElroy, Seth Young, Jane Howard, and William Hayward in custody. And more arrests would continue as they brought down this supposed gang, and James Sterrett, who was familiar with the law for various crimes, John Smith, and Joseph Roberts were added. Added to the list of names but never arrested were William Andrews and F. Davis. They were on the list of persons named by David Roston as affidavit. So Sheriff Cleary brought in John Peoples, did a lineup. Since Peoples didn't know the name of his assailants, Cleary would say he had 20 to 30 witnesses there to ensure the identification process wasn't tainted in any way. But John Fisher would later accuse him of having identified him as he was walking into the lineup, which we will go over at the end of today's story. So, after Peoples reportedly identified John and Lavinia, William Hayward and John Roberts went to court for their quote-unquote assault on David Ross on March 23rd, where 65-year-old they Peebles had reportedly identified them as his assailants, and then John and Lavinia, William Hayward, and John Roberts all went to court for their assault on David Ross on March 23rd. And this was presided by 65-year-old senile judge Elihu Bay, who was said to be crotchety and needed to have evidence shouted at him so you could hear it, which is hilarious. I mean, could you imagine a courtroom today with shit like that happening? Like, Your Honor, as you can clearly see, my client could not have been the one wearing the clown costume when Mr. Brooks was violently attacked and sodomized with a, quote, honking clown nose, as he's been medically proven to have coulrophobia and therefore would have been unable to have even been in that hall of mirrors without violently screaming and running away, most likely into the mirrors, which would have caused Mr. Brooks ample time to escape. And the judge would be like, what did you say again, Sonny? My client has been medically proven to be terrified of clowns, therefore could not have assaulted and sodomized Mr. Brooks with the clown nose while in the Hall of Mirrors. He terrorized clowns and assaulted and sodomized Brooks with a ball of mirrors? Oh, for the love of Christ, he did. Yeah. So that judge would be the one deciding their fates. So that sucked big time. This hearing was to determine if there was enough cause to detain these 4 suspects out of the 12 people that had been listed out. There are some names that I didn't include in David Ross's list, but the rest of them all just get away scot-free, basically. Like, they never get arrested. And it doesn't matter because they never wanted to arrest them. They just wanted to get rid of these guys. So, it's, it's again, crazy, weird, and how, out of the 12, 3 of these people are property owners. Lavinia, I guess, technically doesn't own the property, but John and Hayward own the land, and land that, some property that Governor Geddes would have maybe liked to show off to President Monroe during his visit to Charleston that same year for a potential naval base. That would have made the state a shit ton of money, which it needed desperately at the time, which more on that later. They'll be part of the conspiracy section. So these 4 would be detained and bond was set. So Roberts and Haywood posted their bond, and John and Lavinia would return to jail, as they more than likely couldn't afford to pay it because they weren't highway robbers and didn't have that money. Hayward, probably just had enough money. Also was involved in other crimes. So, but also didn't know the Fishers all that well, just kind of in the neighbor sense. Much like how I don't know most of my neighbors. Like, I have said hi to maybe 2 of them twice. And I've lived here for like 2 years. And I have like 5-10 neighbors, like all along, because I live in a townhome. So there's just a bunch of us all next to each other, and none of us talk to each other. It's great. Love it. Anyways, Hayward just kind of knew them in that sort of neighborly sense. But Joseph Roberts would be rearrested and returned to jail soon after for threatening the life of a local butcher, where supposedly the rest of Lacosse's cow would be found, which is hilarious because this cow keeps popping up in the story. Like, the fucking cow, man. I started like counting how many times the cow was brought up in the book, and I think it was like a total of like 20 something. Like it like page. It was like page 5, and then like periodically would show up until like page 70, which it's amazing. I don't know, this cow was that integral to the story, I guess. Anyways, this guy was threatening that local butcher. Hayward would not return to the first trial, and so it'd only be John and Lavinia Fisher at court on May 10th of 1819, which is what would lead people to the misconception that they acted alone in the crimes and there weren't other people involved in their crimes. The court document lists out the jurors for the trial as Foreman William Hart, Luke Bowes, William Whelan, David Murray, J.S. Packer, William Owens, I. Just Peel, William Matthews, James Fogarty, Joseph Tyler, William Brisbane, Caleb Walker, Peter Galliard, John Davis, and John Wilson. What is interesting is the fact that John Wilson was the state engineer, which is something that Bruce Orr also points out in his book, 6 Miles to Charleston. I will keep referencing that again because I don't want people to think that I was the one who did all this investigative research. I mean, I found someone who did it, and now I'm just trying to because I agree with it, and I looked up the sources. I looked up quite a few of the sources, and they seem to be legit. So this guy did a good job. And, when he brings out all the documents and has all the documents, it makes it easy to be like, okay, well, this is what happened. So I'm just retelling the story here. And I'm trying to make it entertaining in my own way. I'm doing the show my way, but just using that information, compiling it a little different. Anyways, he indicates this would be unusual for a state engineer engaged in these negotiations to have time to be a juror unless it somehow pertained to his work. And for those of you that are unaware, state and local officials can choose to be exempt from participating in a jury and aren't required like the rest of us peasants. So, John Wilson, choosing to do this while in the middle of negotiations, still is an oddity to this case because, he definitely would have had better shit to do unless it pertained to the work he was currently doing. On that note, on May 27th of 1819, the case would be heard. And interesting to note that in David Ross's statements, he never made a clear indication who held, pointed, and fired the weapon at him, which, for this case, they're all being tried for assault with the intent to kill, which, via a lawyer, I would have found this to be an easy W, right? Just immediately. Ask which person fired the deadly weapon, and then absolve everyone else of the charge, as they couldn't have performed the act since only one person assaulted him with a gun. That was his original statement. And then I could get him tied up in a contradictory statement and get the case thrown out. Which it should have been thrown out anyway. This case is just it was a monkey court. Didn't fucking really mean anything at all. And again, while I'm sure throwing one of my clients at the bus, potentially, if he can't actually name someone, then there isn't enough evidence. But this is colonial justice, and worse, this is Southern colonial justice. During a time where they viewed the Bill of Rights as nothing more than a treaty between the federal government and the states, believing they should be able to pick and choose whatever the hell rules they want to follow. Because it's the South, and down in the South, I get to pick and choose whatever the fuck I want to do. And if I want to be a slave-owning racist, I'm going to be a slave-owning racist, god damn it. Fuck you, North. And that was the start of the Civil War, essentially. So John and Lavinia were left in the capable hands of Attorney Davis Heath, and they decided to plead not guilty. Heath had around 12 years of legal experience at the time of their trial, but the prosecution brought in the big guns because the Attorney General for South Carolina was Robert Hayne, who, if you don't know, was a huge proponent of states' rights and gave zero fucks about the Bill of Rights. So, the unlawful search and seizures, cruel and unusual punishments, and multiple other basic rights that were violated by the sheriff and the lynch mob, of which they should already be in trouble for, was not a concern. There was also this guy, Robert Hayne, that was part of the Great Debate in 1830 on the Senate. Yeah, this guy was talented. He was a talented fucker. John and Lavinia were really victims of just the absolute worst fucking luck at this point. And Robert Hayne was just the cherry on top of this shit sundae. Their attorney, I am sure, did his best, but Robert had that sweet, sweet southern talk in circles until you agree with him way about him. And John and Lavinia were found guilty. Then on June 2nd of 1819, John and Lavinia were brought before Judge Colcock for sentencing, and their attorney presented a notice that a motion for a new trial would be made at Constitutional Court, to which there were no objections. During this time, Hayward would be listed as a fugitive, on the run from the long arm of the law. Oh, mama, I can hear you crying. You're so scared and all alone. Sorry, but Hayward was in fact a renegade at this point. And every time I hear that word and think about it, the sticks just play in my head. And the voices, stop. Anyways, Hayward would later be found and drugged back to jail by July 3rd, 1819. So, he had a few months free. Man probably should have left the country, if I'm being honest. Hayward would actually try to help out the Fishers by denying any indication they were in a gang, in a letter he wrote to the City Gazette stating, As to Fisher having any further correspondence with me than dealing in my store, I deny. But as the stranger, what he bought, he paid for. Indicating that Hayward was the inn/store owner of the 5 Mile House and Fisher was just occasionally a customer. Nothing more nefarious than that. So Hayward would be charged leaving leaving now 3 out of the 12 people in this gang, and no one else charged with these crimes against David Ross. So, that's cool. Clearly, they were out for justice. While in prison, John and Lavinia Fisher and Joseph Roberts would make a horrendous mistake that would cost John and Lavinia Fisher their lives, probably. Well, who knows? They probably would have been executed either way. Anyways, on Monday night, September 13th, 1819, John and Joseph Roberts would escape from prison. They would attempt to rescue Lavinia and were forming a plan to do so, as at this point, they believed escape necessary, as they knew they were being set up. Governor Geddes issues a $500 reward for the apprehension of John Fisher on September 15th, 1819. And only John Fisher, not Joseph Roberts. There's no reward money for him. In the statement, it lists him out, so you could probably assume, like, okay, if you get John Fisher, you're going to have to, you'll be bringing John Roberts with you, but he only cared about getting John Fisher. So as long as John Fisher was brought back, you got that $500 reward. Fuck the other guy, apparently. Not Joseph Roberts, the guy who was seen threatening a butcher in addition to all the other charges against him. Nope, just John Fisher, the guy who had a claim to own some prime real estate that would have been great for, a naval base that you wanted to show off to Monroe. Whatever. Again, we'll get into that later. Eventually, John and John Fisher and Roberts were found with some gold and money they had been planning to use as a bribe to bribe a warden to allow Lavinia to escape, and they were tossed back into jail. And on January 17th, 1820, John and Lavinia would go to the Constitutional Court and were convicted of highway robbery and received a much harsher punishment. After a motion for a new trial had been rejected, the Fishers were condemned to be hanged. And if you guys remember, this court was for sentencing. Bruce Orr points out that their charges at this point were changed from assault with intent to murder against David Ross to now highway robbery against John Peoples. So they were tried and convicted for one crime, and on sentencing day, they were sentenced to die for a crime they never went to court for, which is insane to think about. In today's world, they would never have been charged with the crime to begin with, and at most would have had to, maybe pay a fine for stealing a cow or just, helping steal a cow. Even if they did that, and they probably only helped to steal the cow because they knew Stephen Lacoste was totally fucking its poor brains out. Sorry, not sorry, but let's go ahead and get hashtag kill all cow fuckers trending on Twitter or X or wherever the fuck it's called now. So I know there was a lot of fucks in a row, and I kept saying it right there again. But yeah, I know. You guys know what I'm about. They were especially by this point, they were sentenced originally to be hanged on February 4th, 1820, but were granted a slight reprieve by Governor John Geddes, who allowed them some time to make peace with God, and had their executions pushed back to February 18th. A whole 2 weeks. Good for them, I guess. During this time, Lavinia and John were visited by numerous clergy, mostly one by the name of Reverend Dr. Richard Furman, whom John would become quite close to. Lavinia was much more concerned about her life rather than her soul, and convinced herself that she would receive a pardon by the governor, because during this time, hanging a quote-unquote white woman just didn't happen. Now, you might be asking yourselves, why would the governor allow a reprieve for them if he just wanted them out of the picture? Well, Bruce Orr lists a couple of reasons. Reason one, the original... Anyways, Hayward would later be found and drugged back to jail by July 3rd, 1819. So, he had a few months free. Man probably should have left the country, if I'm being honest. Hayward would actually try to help out the Fishers by denying any indication they were in a gang, in a letter he wrote to the City Gazette stating, "As to Fisher having any further correspondence with me than dealing in my store, I deny. But as the stranger, what he bought, he paid for." Indicating that Hayward was the inn/store owner of the 5 Mile House and Fisher was just occasionally a customer. Nothing more nefarious than that. So Hayward would be charged leaving leaving now 3 out of the 12 people in this gang, and no one else charged with these crimes against David Ross. So, that's cool. Clearly, they were out for justice. While in prison, John and Lavinia Fisher and Joseph Roberts would make a horrendous mistake that would cost John and Lavinia Fisher their lives, probably. Well, who knows? They probably would have been executed either way. Anyways, on Monday night, September 13th, 1819, John and Joseph Roberts would escape from prison. They would attempt to rescue Lavinia and were forming a plan to do so, as at this point, they believed escape necessary, as they knew they were being set up. Governor Geddes issues a $500 reward for the apprehension of John Fisher on September 15th, 1819. And only John Fisher, not Joseph Roberts. There's no reward money for him. In the statement, it lists him out, so you could probably assume, like, okay, if you get John Fisher, you're going to have to, you'll be bringing John Roberts with you. But he only cared about getting John Fisher. So as long as John Fisher was brought back, you got that $500 reward. Fuck the other guy, apparently. Not Joseph Roberts, the guy who was seen threatening a butcher in addition to all the other charges against him. Nope, just John Fisher, the guy who had a claim to own some prime real estate that would have been great for, a naval base that you wanted to show off to Monroe. Whatever. Again, we'll get into that later. Eventually, John and John Fisher and Roberts were found with some gold and money they had been planning to use as a bribe to bribe a warden to allow Lavinia to escape, and they were tossed back into jail. And on January 17th, 1820, John and Lavinia would go to the Constitutional Court and were convicted of highway robbery and received a much harsher punishment. After a motion for a new trial had been rejected, the Fishers were condemned to be hanged. And if you guys remember, this court was for sentencing. Bruce Orr points out that their charges at this point were changed from assault with intent to murder against David Ross to now highway robbery against John Peoples. So they were tried and convicted for one crime, and on sentencing day, they were sentenced to die for a crime they never went to court for, which is insane to think about. In today's world, they would never have been charged with a crime to begin with, and at most would have had to, maybe pay a fine for stealing a cow or just, helping steal a cow. Even if they did that, and they probably only helped to steal the cow because they knew Stephen Lacoste was totally fucking its poor brains out. Sorry, not sorry, but let's go ahead and get hashtag kill all cow fuckers trending on Twitter or X or wherever the fuck it's called now. So I know that was a lot of fucks in a row, and I kept saying it right there again. But yeah, I know. You guys know what I'm about. They were especially by this point, they were sentenced originally to be hanged on February 4th, 1820, but were granted a slight reprieve by Governor John Geddes, who allowed them some time to make peace with God and had their executions pushed back to February 18th. A whole 2 weeks. Good for them, I guess. During this time, Lavinia and John were visited by numerous clergy, mostly one by the name of Reverend Dr. Richard Furman, whom John would become quite close to. Lavinia was much more concerned about her life rather than her soul, and convinced herself that she would receive a pardon by the governor, because during this time, hanging a quote-unquote white woman just didn't happen. Now, you might be asking yourselves, why would the governor allow a reprieve for them if he just wanted them out of the picture? Well, Bruce Orr lists a couple of reasons. Reason 1, the original execution date fell during race week, and it is possible that the governor was more concerned about having people deterred from spending money on the games and events in the city and being distracted by going to good old hanging. So he's like, listen, hanging brings in some revenue, but not enough revenue to compensate losing the revenue from the races. So if we push it back a little bit, they'll be spending money on the race games, get a little more time to get some more money, and then come back again for the hanging and spend more money, because he was more concerned about money. Reason 2, there was a pamphlet from the time that indicated a man had confessed to the crimes that John and Lavinia Fisher were sentenced for, and was already brought before the magistrate, and in his confession knew the exact times when the crimes took place and the exact place where the crimes happened. So he knew some details too that he wouldn't have even gotten from like newspapers at the time, which is crazy. So there was hope that the Fishers might be exonerated, and Nathaniel Coverley had printed that in a pamphlet that caught the public's attention, so now the public knew. So the governor might have felt like a little forced to. Lavinia also got a lot of support from the fashionable ladies of Charleston. That is their name. That is the group name. With them stating that they felt that the execution of a white female, because it's the South and they are racist fucks during this time and don't really give a crap about, African American women. Anyways, they thought that this would be a reflection on all women. Well, white women. Basically saying if you hang one white woman, what's to stop y'all from killing the rest of us? And they petitioned the governor about this because they didn't want to hang either. So now we have this entirely different picture than what the tale that I told at the beginning of Lavinia Fisher had us believe. Originally, where they were, they're kind of liked by the town, and then eventually these evil people were just despised. Instead, we see that these are two regular people who had many public supporters, but not enough supporters in high enough places in the government, it seems. Because it didn't matter in the end. Also, the reprieve granted by the confession wouldn't last because the guy that had confessed was re-examined, which usually in the re-examination usually involves torture and being stretched and beaten, especially in Charleston. They had like this little they cuff you to the ceiling and you get cuffed to the floor and you essentially be like suspended in air, and they crank it and stretch you until you couldn't stretch any further, and then beat you with sticks. Which I wonder if someone was told to, quote, beat the real truth out of him. But, someone who didn't want their plans getting fucked up, like the governor or, like the sheriff or someone. So on February 18th of 1820, the Charleston Courier would publish this statement. Execution. The awful sentence of law is this day to be carried into effect upon John Fisher and Lavinia, his wife, who was sentenced to death at the late sitting of the Constitutional Court for the crime of highway robbery. We understand they are to meet the fate without the lines on Meeting Street Road between the hours of 12 and 4 o'clock. The appointed day has arrived, the moment soon to come, which will finish my earthly career, and it behooves me for the last time to address you and the reverend gentlemen associated in your pious care. For your exertions in explaining the mystery of our holy religion and the merits of our dear Redeemer, for pious sympathy and benevolent regards as concerns our immortal souls, except, sir, for yourself, and them, the last benediction of the unfortunate. God, in his infinite mercy, reward you all. In a few moments, and the world, to me, shall have passed away, before the throne of the eternal majesty of heaven I must stand. Shall then, at this dreadful hour, my convulsed, agitated lips still proclaim a falsehood? No. Then, by that awful majesty, I swear I am innocent. May the Redeemer of the world plead for those who have sworn away my life. To the unfortunate, the voice of condolence is sweet. The language of commiseration is delightful. The feelings I have experienced in the society of Mr. Blank, a stranger. He rejected not our prayer, unknown. He shut not his ear to our supplication. He has alleviated our sorrows. May God bless him. He has wept with us. May angels rejoice with him at a throne of glory. Enclosed, sir, is a key that secretes my little all. Give it him, and say for me, as he deserted me not while living, I hope he will discharge my last request. Now my property is to be disposed of. He will find explained in a paper within my trunk, to which is attached a schedule of the whole. I only wish him to see it removed to a place of safety, until to whom it is given shall call for it. The hour is come. Farewell, sir. Farewell, John Fisher. The receiver of the gift is believed to have been Richard Furman, by the way. And what a letter, right? Yeah, basically him being like, listen, I'm innocent. And eventually there's another letter that will state and call out the sheriff for essentially stating his name as he was walking down for the identification process to like point him out, and blaming him for getting killed. And yeah. Anyways, after this, they were both hanged and pronounced dead. John Fisher was only 29 years old. Lavinia was 28. They both could have had so much more life ahead of them and were cheated of it. William Hayward would be hanged a few days later. So out of the 12 people in this gang, only 3 would be hanged for the crime. And they were the only people. The appointed day has arrived, the moment soon to come, which will finish my earthly career, and it behoves me, for the last time, to address you and the reverend gentlemen associated in your pious care. For your exertions in explaining the mystery of our holy religion and the merits of our dear Redeemer, for pious sympathy and benevolent regards as concerns our immortal souls, except, sir, for yourself, and them, the last benediction of the unfortunate. God, in his infinite mercy, reward you all. In a few moments, and the world, to me, shall have passed away, before the throne of the eternal majesty of heaven I must stand. Shall then, at this dreadful hour, my convulsed, agitated lips still proclaim a falsehood? No. Then, by that awful majesty, I swear I am innocent. May the Redeemer of the world plead for those who have sworn away my life. To the unfortunate.
Historic conspiracies.
Today we're going to be going briefly, I do mean briefly, over the conspiracies that are believed to have taken place in this tale. The first one is John Fisher had claim to some land. So John Fisher's father, he was essentially granted he was going to be awarded some money from William Hayward's father, or I guess ancestor as well, who owned the land plotted by the 5 Mile to 6 Mile house. And so the idea here is that John and Hayward were essentially the owners of this land, and that the money that was paid back to John's dad was in form of the land that was given. And so that's why John and Lavinia had the house. The second one is Colonel George Fisher was John's uncle and was the executor of John's dad's will, and had recently lost land, and so needed the heir to be out of the picture. And so his son-in-law, Mr. Ross, had his brother, David, get a mob together to lynch and seize it out of his hands. So by using lynch law, Colonel George Fisher would have been able to essentially take the land back from his nephew. And the other conspiracy here is that Lavinia Fisher was potentially a mulatto or mixed race slave of Colonel George Fisher, as there is a bill of sale for one Lavinia Fisher in like 1807 to the Ross family. So the idea here is that that John essentially went and stole the slave, and wasn't supposed to marry her, but married her essentially, and which is why the governor was cool with hanging a quote unquote white woman, and white people might have been chill with it. And then Governor Geeds was a con man later in life, and this may have been his first attempt at conning out some land from people, or really just like robbing it from them. There's also the sheriff. The sheriff was up for re-election and was rounding up all of the quote unquote ne'er-do-wells that he, regular people that he knew had been in trouble with the law in the past. John had a run-in, but was pardoned by the governor before, a separate governor. And then the rest of them all had various crimes that they'd committed in the past, but nothing like murder. A couple of them had done like robbery and like attempted to beat people before, but nothing crazy. if you want to learn more about these conspiracies and get a little bit of like a deeper dive into it, please go check out 6 Miles to Charleston from Bruce Orr. It's a really good book. He ties together a lot of information really well. I've already been telling this story for about over an hour now at this point, and it is late for me. So I'm going to close out this historic conspiracy segment. It's kind of like a top 5 conspiracies about this story, sort of idea that I want to do. If you like this segment, let me know. It's something that I'm thinking about like adding to future historical quarrels, where it's like, okay, what are some conspiracies about this tale? What is what do some people think happened, or what are some the dark secrets essentially going on? And it's just interesting. And then tying it back to like reality and doing something like this with like investigative journalism, like Bruce Orr did, would be cool. I'd like to do that more. And so I'm planning on making the show a little better. So we're going to come out of this segment now, go into my kind of end bit / rambling bit. So if you guys don't like that, you don't have to stick around. Thank you for listening. If you liked what I did today, please like, subscribe, leave a review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get the podcasts. Let me know how I'm doing, and let me know how I can improve. I always love to improve. So, but for those who aren't sticking around, it's good. Thank you for listening. Yeah, I'll see you in the next episode. For those sticking around, I'm just gonna be talking about life and plans. So that's the end here. Sorry, I know that historic conspiracies bit is a little rushed. I'm still kind of trying to work out the kinks. I want it to be like a short segment, like not too long, more of like a 2-3 minute thing where I just like list out some conspiracies, try to give as brief summary about them as possible, like while providing enough information to make it like interesting, like a little test of the conspiracies there. Just an idea that I'm working on. I'll workshop it some more too, get it a little better for you listeners. Now for real though, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being such great supporters of the show, for sharing it with as many people as you have, and for the show growing. It's been really cool to watch. I know it's a slow process. It's a slow but steady process that I'm sure will happen over time. But I don't know, it's just been cool. I hope this episode was good, that you enjoyed the way I did this information. I spent quite a bit of time this week trying to like type out everything, and I know I used the book a lot for the information, but like he had already gathered up everything, so it's just like shit. Well, he has everything gathered up. I don't have to go and pull the documents myself just in case he missed something. At least I trusted this guy enough. So I mean, if you guys know more about this, or like know more about the author and like how trustworthy or not trustworthy they are, let me know, because that'd be good. Hopefully I didn't just like spew a bunch of bullshit this whole time. Pretty sure I didn't. Just because again, like the papers really were from Charleston, South Carolina. Like you can go verify like where they're from and make sure like it's a real document at the very least. But to pull it and to read it, you have to either go there or like request it from like this library in Charleston, which I did not want to do. I didn't want to have to fly all the way to Charleston, try and get all the documents gathered by this guy, which there's a parcel in this library that has all the documents that he gathered, and he's like the only one to do it. So I am of the mind to think that this is legit. So if in case you all want to argue and dispute it, you can go look it up yourself. But John and Lavinia did not murder anyone, essentially. So, sorry if you guys thought this was going to be more of like a true... Well, it was a true crime. It was they got set up, man. They got set up and fucked over. Like 2 people were murdered for money, I'm pretty sure. And the reason why Colonel George Fisher needed the money is because he lost some land to Native American tribes attacking and taking that land back over, and the government wouldn't refund him for it. So he's like, well, where can I go get where else can I go get money? Oh, that's right. My brother had some land that was given to him, and my nephew owns it. I can just go kill my nephew because fuck that guy. Fucking slave stealing bitch. Basically, is the idea that like Uncle George Fisher, Colonel, that Colonel asshole was a bit of a dick. So I don't know. If you guys have more information or more thoughts on it, let me know. What do you guys think? Based on the information that was provided and the court records and documents that were shown, and like based off of like just the common sense too, because like again, they were tried and convicted for one crime, a crime, by the way, where a mob came out of nowhere, went onto their property, attacked them, and they were apparently expected to just not defend themselves. Like, how fucked is that? How fucked, man? So there's that. But I don't know. Whatever you guys' thoughts are, if you guys know, if you know a little more, I've heard of the Charleston ghost tours and the tales about Lavinia. They sound cool, but I mean, if anything, she's haunting people because like they've been telling a story of her using oleander, flowers to kill people, and like say she was a murderer for the past 190 years after a case where she was probably very clearly innocent, and more than probably, she, at least to me, was very clearly innocent, and now has been deemed America's first female serial killer. How fucked is that? She didn't even kill anyone. She's the first female serial killer. So she was not the first woman hanged either. That would be some lady back in the 1700s. And there've been, other incidents of women being killed by colonial justice as well. And then there's also the Salem witch trials and a bunch of other bullshit that's happened to women. So, Lavinia was not the first to be targeted and hated on, like many people claim. There's other women throughout history in America that were targeted. As far as that goes, though, the show has been a lot of. Sorry, I know that historic conspiracies bit is a little rushed. I'm still kind of trying to work out the kinks. I want it to be like a short segment, like not too long, more of like a 2-3 minute thing where I just like list out some conspiracies, try to give as brief summary about them as possible, like while providing enough information to make it like interesting, like a little test of the conspiracies there. Just an idea that I'm working on. I'll workshop it some more too, get it a little better for you listeners. Now for real though, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being such great supporters of the show, for sharing it with as many people if you have, and for the show growing. It's been really cool to watch. It's I know it's a slow process. It's a slow but steady process that I'm sure will happen over time. But I don't know, it's just been cool. I hope this episode was good, that you enjoyed the way I did this information. I spent quite a bit of time this week trying to like type out everything. And I know I used the book a lot for the information, but like he had already gathered up everything. So it's just like, shit, well, he has everything gathered up. I don't have to go and pull the documents myself just in case he missed something. At least I trusted this guy enough. So, I mean, if you guys know more about this or like know more about the author and like how trustworthy or not trustworthy they are, let me know, because that'd be good. Hopefully I didn't just like spew a bunch of bullshit this whole time. Pretty sure I didn't. Just because, again, like the papers really were from Charleston, South Carolina. They like you can go verify like where they're from and make sure like it's a real document at the very least. But to pull it and to read it, you have to either go there or like request it from like this library in Charleston, which I did not want to do. I didn't want to have to fly all the way to Charleston, try and get all the documents gathered by this guy, which there's a parcel in this library that has all the documents that he gathered, and he's like the only one to do it. So I am of the mind to think that this is legit. So if in case you all want to argue and dispute it, you can go look it up yourself. But John and Lavinia did not murder anyone, essentially. So, sorry if you guys thought this was going to be more of like a true... Well, it was a true crime. It was they got set up, man. They got set up and fucked over. Like, 2 people were murdered for money, I'm pretty sure. And the reason why Colonel George Fisher needed the money is because he lost some land to Native American tribes attacking and taking that land back over, and the government wouldn't refund him for it. So he's like, well, where can I go get where where else can I go get money? Oh, that's right. My brother had some land that was given to him, and my nephew owns it. If I can just go kill my nephew, because fuck that guy. Fucking slave-stealing bitch. Basically, is the idea that, like, Uncle George